Leftists and some liberals are all for tackling racism and discrimination, right up until it comes to tackling racism against white people and Asians, which are the only groups perfectly legal to be racist against. That's when it's suddenly a problem and disturbing, but the Trump administration decided not to give a damn and push forward anyway. In other older news, the Education Secretary is looking at misandric policies in universities, another disturbing actions for some liberals and most helicopterables. All of this is good stuff, but what's even better is that at least some members of the Trump administration seem to legitimately understand where the cancer lies, namely inside the bureaucracies, the career officials, the agenda-driven totalitarians whom nobody votes for and almost nobody can fire, but who get to dictate rules not just for the entirety of the United States of America, but also influence culture indirectly and have that filth exported everywhere else. And that's our topic in this episode. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so back in December 2016, long before everyone spoke about the deep state, I actually made a video called exactly that, the deep state, in which I said the following. Basically, the deep state is the ultimate step. Wisdom tells us that politics is downstream from culture. Andrew Breitbart postulated that politics is 20 years downstream from culture. Now, he wasn't necessarily wrong, just a bit inaccurate. The deep state is 20 years downstream from culture. Politics in general are usually less than that, still downstream but not 20 years, roughly 10 years downstream from culture. Now, these values vary incredibly depending on the issue, but the main point still does remain. Culture is the avant-garde, politics is the main step, and the deep state is the ultimate goal. Alright, so, in fewer words, political operatives should aim to create a deep state or subvert the existent one. And this is where we, as non-leftists, are usually behind in most of Europe and North America. And this is where I hope Trump will get it. He may be the president and get to make so many glorious picks, but the deep state at the federal level is still leftist. The big advantage in America is that at local levels the deep state is still largely conservative. So the mission should be to take some of that awesomeness and bring it on federal level and ferment an ossified deep state that works a lot more, well, conservatively than it does now. Now, doing that will ensure a continuation of a Trump-like attitude and agenda, even if the next administration will be Democrat. Reagan was the last president who understood this. History now notes that his era was one where the country as a whole shifted rightwards. And that is true, but Reagan also took that shift and used it to ossify a deep state that took decades to tear apart. Most of that deep state was alive and well in 2000, and even some of it as late as 2009. That is what Trump needs to do. Now, I don't know if he will do it, but I sure hope he does. Now remember, that is a recording from before Trump was president and before the topic of the deep state was an issue openly discussed in public and polite society. And the reason I mention this is, of course, in part to reiterate that you'll find better analysis here than on any cathedral outlet, but also because what I said I hope will happen has actually started to happen. So,
As I said in the intro, less than a month ago, Betsy DeVos went to speak with the National Coalition for Men and other non-feminist groups about the huge purulent infection that is feminist dogma that ruins the lives of countless innocent young men via false allegations of sexual misconduct dogmatically believed by militant feminists in college kangaroo courts. Leftists went nuts at the time precisely because they know, just like we know, that if the education secretary bypasses the entrenched bureaucracies in the government and also bypasses the entrenched activist officials in universities, then the truth can and will no longer be hidden. And once the truth fully comes out, the feminist bollocks and their cushy government jobs, which they use for militant leftist and feminist activism, go straight into the dustbin. In other words, that section of the leftist deep state is gone. But now, just a few minutes before preparing the script for this video, although it will be a few days until you will see this, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has set his eyes on another segment of the leftist deep state, the militant anti-white racists in the so-called Office of Civil Rights, which should have been dismantled 2 decades ago, but like any other bureaucracy, the closest thing to eternal life is a temporary government program. Anyway, so the story is broke by the New York Times, a former newspaper and esteemed toilet paper of record. The story is well written in the sense that it also brings some other background information, which in fact solidify what I've been saying and hoping would happen 9 months ago when I made the Deep State video. So, the Pravda on Hudson titles Justice Department to take on affirmative action in college admissions. Very long article, but most of it totally worth it. Quote, the Trump administration is preparing to redirect resources of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division towards investigating and suing universities over affirmative action admission policies deemed to discriminate against white applicants, according to a document obtained by the New York Times. The document, an internal announcement to the Civil Rights Division, seeks current lawyers interested in working for a new project on investigations and possible litigation related to intentional race-based discrimination in college and university admissions. The announcement suggests that the project will be run out of the division's front office, where the Trump administration's political appointees work, rather than its educational opportunities section, which is run by career civil servants and normally handles work involving schools and universities. And this is fantastic. Again, whoever came up with this, not the idea itself, but the implementation, is someone who understands how militant racist leftism established its hegemony in the first place. This is precisely how it should be done. Start from the premise that career civil servants are scum, because they overwhelmingly are, and run things through the people you trust. If more people on the non-left understood this, most of these problems would have never happened to begin with. Anyway, going forward. Quote, the document does not explicitly identify whom the Justice Department considers at risk of discrimination because of affirmative action admission policies, but the phrasing it uses, intentional race-based discrimination, cuts to the heart of programs designed to bring more minority students to university campuses. Supporters and critics of the project said it was clearly targeting admission programs that can give members of generally disadvantaged groups like Black and Latino students an edge over other applicants with comparable or higher test scores. The project is another sign that the Civil Rights Division is taking on a conservative tilt under President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It follows other changes in Justice Department policy on voting rights, gay rights, and police reforms. Yeah, we talked about the voting rights part on July the 15th on this channel. It's a peculiar thing with American leftists. Anywhere else in the world, from the far left to the far right, everyone agrees that showing a government-issued photo ID before you cast your vote is absolute normality and common sense. Only in America is something as normal and fair as this a partisan issue, and as always, with the Democrats being on the very, very wrong side of it. Anyway, Roger Clegg, a former top official in the Civil Rights Division during the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration, who is now the president of the conservative Center for Equal Opportunity, called the project a welcome and long overdue development as the United States become increasingly multiracial. The civil rights laws were deliberately written to protect everyone from discrimination, and it is frequently the case that not only are whites discriminated against now, but frequently Asian Americans as well, he said, and this is exactly true. Now, while anti-white bias is an obvious issue, not just in admissions, but in everything colleges do these days, there is also the less known but at least equally bad situation of anti-Asian bias. Lots and lots of Americans of Korean and Japanese descent are denied opportunities because they're too smart, essentially, and we need diversity. Now this is madness. Anyway, so after quoting one normal human being for exactly one paragraph, the New York Times then goes on to quote communists for 2 paragraphs because, you know, there is no leftist bias on this former newspaper. Quote, "But Kristen Clark, the president of the Liberal Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, criticized the Affirmative Action Project as misaligned with the division's long-standing priorities. She noted that the Civil Rights Division was created and launched to deal with the unique problem of discrimination faced by our nation's most oppressed minority groups, performing work that often no one else has the resources or the expertise to do. This is deeply disturbing," she said. "It would be a dog whistle that could invite a lot of chaos and unnecessarily create hysteria among colleges and universities who may fear that the government may come down on them for their efforts to maintain diversity on their campuses." I mean, implying that's a bad thing. Now, this militant commie lawyer is correct when she says that it would create chaos and hysteria among colleges and universities who may fear that the government may come down on them. She is wrong in saying that's unnecessary or implying that's a bad thing. It isn't. It's the best thing that happened to colleges since mid-1980s. The college system is essentially both the home and the factory of almost the entirety of the militant, racist, leftist deep state. So shaking things up there is mandatory for any mentally sane society. Also, our liberal friends would tell us that this is moral. I mean, racists should absolutely fear and be hysterical that at any point the almighty state could come down on them and crack down on their racism. That's what our liberal friends routinely tell us. Well, if that's the case, then surely the plurality of racists in the university system should be held to the same standards as the racists who wear hoodies, right? So which is it, liberals? You can't have it both ways. Either racism is okay, or it isn't. From where I'm standing, racism on public dollars is definitely not okay, for anyone and against anyone. I differ from liberals, though, when it comes to the private sphere. That's why I don't criticize organizations who create black spaces or things like that. I wish them good luck, honestly. On their property, they should be free to associate and disassociate with whomever they please. But on taxpayers, no, you don't get to pull the diversity card and then discriminate against smarter people based on race. Anyway, going further with the article, quote, "The Justice Department declined to provide more details about its plans or to make the acting head of the Civil Rights Division, John Gore, available for an interview. The Department of Justice does not discuss personnel matters, so will decline comment," said Devin O'Malley, a department spokesman. The Supreme Court has ruled that the educational benefits that flow from having a diverse student body can justify using race as one factor among many in a holistic evaluation, while rejecting blunt racial quotas or race-based point systems. But what that permits in actual practice by university, public ones as well as private ones that receive federal funding, is often murky. Mr. Clegg said he would expect the project to focus on investigating complaints the Civil Rights Division received about any university admission programs. He also suggested that the project would look for stark gaps in test scores and dropout rates among different racial cohorts within student bodies, which he said would be evidence suggesting that admission offices were putting too great an emphasis on applicants' race and crossing the line the Supreme Court has drawn. Some of that data, he added, could be available through the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights, which did not respond to a request for comment. So, this is an argument routinely brought in the Facebook comment section of this article, which I will leave a link to in the low bar. Namely that the Supreme Court already ruled on this and white privilege lost. Seriously, that's their phrasing. The only problem is that's not exactly true. The Supreme Court only said you're still allowed to have race on the admission form and maybe take it into consideration in some instances, but making sure you take many other factors into consideration as well. It didn't say you can have diversity quotas. In fact, it explicitly ruled against that. Also, a Supreme Court ruling is not some dictate from God or superior natural wisdom that can't be changed. Most of these cases were 5-4 or 4-3 rulings, as the New York Times explained further in the article. So, these cases were ruled with a narrow margin, with the far leftist votes cast by the oldest members, who will soon be, dead, and to be replaced with younger and saner judges. This idea that just because you have a Supreme Court ruling that's somehow unchangeable, that's lunacy. Also, when a decision is vague enough, as it is the one cited by the New York Times, then that in fact means the government gets to write the guidelines and fill the gaps. That's how normal government works anywhere in the non-totalitarian world. Anyway, what's really interesting is the last third of the article, where we get some very interesting insight into how this administration actually does work to dismantle the militant racist deep state. Quote, the pending start of the affirmative action project, the Vision lawyers who want to work on it must submit their resumes by August the 9th, the announcement said, joins a series of changes involving civil rights law since Mr. Trump's inauguration. In a lawsuit challenging Texas's strict voter identification law, the Justice Department switched its position, dropping the claim that the law was intentionally discriminatory and later declaring that the law had been fixed. Mr. Sessions has also made clear he is not interested in using consent decrees to impose reforms on troubled police departments and has initiated a sweeping review of existing agreements. Last week, the Justice Department, without being asked, filed a brief in a private employment discrimination lawsuit. It urged an appeals court not to interpret the ban on sex-based discrimination in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as covering sexual orientation. The Obama administration had shied from taking a stand on that question. Vanita Gupta, who ran the Civil Rights Division in the Obama administration's second term and is now president of the Liberal Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, noted that the briefs in the Texas voter identification and gay rights cases were signed only by Trump administration political appointees, not career officials, just as the Affirmative Action Project will apparently be run directly by the division's front office. The fact that the position is in the political front office and not in the career section that enforces anti-discrimination laws for education suggests that this person will be carrying out an agenda aimed at undermining diversity in higher education without needing to say it, Mrs. Gupta said. Yeah, so? No, seriously. So what? She's basically complaining that these things aren't run through her friends, but through people who might actually be friends of normal people. And also, let's cut the crap. It's not about undermining diversity in higher education that you're afraid of. You're afraid that this may actually help white people, especially white men, now a minuscule and universally hated minority in campuses. That is what you're afraid of. Now, if it is any comfort, this will actually help Asians a lot more than white men, but yes, they will also crack down on the unearned privileges of Negroes and so-called Hispanics, which is a term that always amused me, since anyone can be a Hispanic, although it is at least less vague than Latino, in which almost 1 billion people qualify. Anyway, this is not the first time a Republican administration tries to do this, as the toilet paper on record informs us, but kept this for the very lower end of the article where nobody really reads, because if the headline had been "Trump admin does what the Bush admin did too," nobody would click on the article, I suppose. Anyway, quote, the Civil Rights Division has been a recurring culture war battleground as it passed between Democratic and Republican administrations. During the administration of George W. Bush, its overseers violated civil service hiring laws, an inspector general found, by filling its career ranks with conservatives who often had scant experience in civil rights law. At the same time, it brought fewer cases alleging systematic discrimination against minorities and more alleging reverse discrimination against whites, like a 2006 lawsuit forcing Southern Illinois University university to stop reserving certain fellowships programs for women or members of underrepresented racial groups. In 2009, the Obama administration vowed to revitalize the agency and hired career officials who brought in many new lawyers with experience working for traditional liberal-leaning civil rights organizations. So, the New York Times, a former newspaper, basically admits that this is a culture issue and a war, and that there was a deliberate and conscious effort to fill the place with militant, partisan, racist, leftist hacks. When the forces of the non-left kept on saying that this was indeed happening, the cathedral pretended that it's just a figment of our imagination. Only now, when it matters a lot less and after a tremendous amount of damage has been done, only now this purulent rag finally says it, although in fine print, that yeah, the Obama administration actually did stuff the place with militant collectivists. And then you wonder why nobody trusts you, or why even many liberal Democrats marginally trust Donald Trump a lot more than your sorry lot. This is why. Because there comes a point when too much bias bothers people, even if it's in their own favor. Anyway, on the broader point, the whole business of civil rights should just be abolished entirely, alongside with federal funding for any university. Let them privately run things the way they see fit. Let's see how profitable racism would be once it's no longer protected by the government. I suspect it's not so profitable. One of the reasons tuition costs have been soaring way faster than inflation is precisely the fact that the government got involved so much. When you have government-guaranteed student loans, which means the universities get to see their money no matter what, and also government funding to the universities, the incentive for these said universities is to become more and more wasteful in their spending. And they gotta recoup those costs somehow, so they raise tuition fees and presumably put more pressure on their donors. The University of Missouri, even though entirely taxpayer-funded institution, is learning as we speak why wasteful spending is cancer. Once the enrollments collapsed and donors finally got pissed off, suddenly they started to adopt conservative measures, such as cracking down on the racists, shutting down useless programs, shutting down buildings that should not have been built in the first place, and so on and so forth. Imagine the wonders this would make to private universities if left to their own devices and taxpayer fund would be entirely cut out from them. Or at least the federal funding. Let the states deal with it. I thought that any power not explicitly vested to the United States, that would be the federal government, is to be left to the states or the people thereof. So let that be the guiding principle. If the folks in California, let's say, want to spend billions on racist programs, let them do it. But why should the taxpayers in Texas be forced to bear with such nonsense just because the Office of Civil Rights in the very distant capital thinks this is okay? Anyway, very good on Trump administration. Whoever came up with these two ideas should come up with more of these. This is really draining the swamp. If you expected this to be easy, well, you are wrong. The swamp will fight back, and draining it is not easy. But it is possible. All it takes is patience and an unwavering will to do it. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. And I'll see you all very soon on Freedom Alternative.